I'm getting better at it.
Oh. I will learn new things. Updates.
The sound here is not very good.
Hi everyone. So I think we're going to get going now. Thank you so much all for coming. It's great to see you all. So welcome to this event here in the MDB Pavilion on innovative finance, MDB finance for adaptation, how to scale up innovation, how to think more creatively about adaptation finance. It's great to have you all here. This is an event that's being co-hosted by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the European Investment Bank. So thank you very much to both of those institutions for co-hosting this event. My name's Sonia Dunlop. I'm the program lead for MDBs and public banks at E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism. We're a climate change think tank with offices all over the world working on different aspects of climate policy, including sustainable finance and multilateral development banks. And this event is actually the culmination of a whole series of workshops, technical level workshops that we've been holding with our partners in the multilateral development banks to think together about different ways of mainstreaming adaptation in the work of the MDBs and to think more creatively about how we can mobilize the adaptation finance that we need in order to close the adaptation finance gap and scale up that finance that we need. We have a great series of speakers. Welcome, welcome. We have a great panel with us. We have some great speakers today. We're going to kick off with some opening remarks from Debbie Palmer, the Director for Energy, Climate and Environment at the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Then we're going to move to our panel with Diane Black-Lane, the Director of the Environment Department and Climate Ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda. Thank you for joining us. I know you're very busy. We're also going to, also on our panel is Gareth Phillips, climate manager at the African Development Bank. Hi, Gareth. As well as Daouda Ndaye, lead climate expert from the Islamic Development Bank, one of the co-chairs of the Adaptation Working Group. Purvi Mehta from the Director for Agriculture and Asia and Climate at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, representing philanthropy. And Frederick Uma, the Climate Finance Negotiator for the Government of Kenya, also representing Transparency International. We will then have some closing remarks from Stephen O'Driscoll, Manager for Climate and Environment at the European Investment Bank. And we will at some point also be joined by the Vice President of the African Development Bank, Kevin Kariuki, who's very kindly said he will come by to make some remarks in his busy schedule. So thank you all for joining. I'll be presenting the results of the technical workshops in a few moments, but first I would just like to ask Debbie Palmer, Director for Energy, Climate and Environment at the UK's FCDO, to come and give some opening remarks as one of the hosts for today's event. Debbie, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. Sonia's already introduced me. It's lovely to be here representing the UK, and I also just want to give a big shout out to Stephen O'Driscoll from the EIB. We're really delighted to be co-chairing this event with the EIB this afternoon. So, why are we gathering here this afternoon? Well, the sum total is because existing levels of adaptation finance are nowhere near enough to meet the Paris requirement of balance, or indeed the scale of needs. So we have made some recent progress. Under the UK's presidency, almost all developed country climate finance providers made new, forward-looking climate finance commitments, with many doubling or even quadrupling their support for developing countries to take climate action. So that's great news. And at COP26, developed country contributors collectively committed to double finance for adaptation on 2019 levels by 2025. And I'm really pleased that this week the UK has also announced a tripling of our funding for adaptation on 2019 levels to 1.5 billion in 2025. It was great to hear our Prime Minister on Monday stand up and make that very strong commitment. So I'm really pleased that we've got some progress, and within that, of course, the MDBs are playing an absolutely critical role. 6 of the MDBs have increased their overall climate finance targets before they did that before COP26. And I'm going to pause for a minute, if I may, and congratulate the EIB in particular, as co-chair, who at COP26 set a 15% target for adaptation as a share of their total climate finance. But I also want to congratulate the MDBs as a group for meeting their 18 billion collective expectation for adaptation finance 2019 to 2025, which of course they've achieved this year, which is a really, really impressive achievement. This is 4 years ahead of schedule, and it's something that I do think we collectively need to congratulate you for, say thank you for, and keep encouraging you to do more as you go forward. Of course, having achieved that, expectations are high for more. And really, there is an expectation that even more finance for adaptation should be available by the 2025 deadline. So I'm keen to encourage MDBs here gathered to make public their forecasts at the earliest opportunities, because that will help meet the demand from vulnerable countries for more predictability of adaptation finance, which, as we know, is an absolutely key demand. Nevertheless, we know that even if we achieve that doubling of adaptation finance in 2025, even that is still going to be insufficient to meet the scale of needs estimated by the UN Environment Programme and others. So my single key message for this afternoon is very much that we need to think differently. We need to move beyond business as usual if we're going to plug the gap in adaptation finance. Because our current climate finance approaches, they fail to address the very specific barriers that exist to mobilising finance for adaptation. So we've got a really big challenge ahead of us. Happily, we're not starting from scratch. As I said, each individual MDB is making great progress, and each MDB here has got very concrete examples of innovative financing for adaptation. So to highlight just one example, I know the African Development Bank have just announced a new climate action window, to which the UK is making a £200 million contribution for adaptation. And the workshops which the UK has been convening with the help of E3G have been taking stock of this announcement and other examples across the MDBs as the sort of innovative financing and innovative approaches we need. And we've been looking through those workshops at how we build on these efforts to unlock new and innovative sources of finance within the MDB system for each specific sector. We've also used these workshops to discuss how to mainstream adaptation better across a number of sectors, including cooling, including agriculture, and also looking specifically at food security. So I hope that we will all leave today's session inspired to focus in on the most promising areas for collaboration across the MDBs as a group, and other stakeholders of course, to ensure that we achieve even more mainstreaming, even more innovative financing, and even more leveraging of private sector finance for adaptation. My hope is that by the time we get to COP28, the MDBs will have taken forward some of the ideas that we're discussing here today and actually put them into action, with a view to launching a whole set of exciting new programs to support adaptation, as well as I said, I hope, moving forward and making public their revised collective forecasts for 2025. So before I end, I just want to say a few thank yous. First of all, thank you to E3G for supporting us to organise this event. Thank you very much sincerely to the collective group of MDBs here present who've contributed really constructively and really wholeheartedly to the workshops over the past few weeks leading up to this event. Thank you also for all our panellists for agreeing to join us for this discussion, and thank you to the European Investment Bank for hosting this event and co-chairing it with us and allowing the UK to hold it in your pavilion. Thank you very much, Stephen and colleagues. So thank you all for joining us for this session this evening. And let me hand back to Sonia to talk us through the summary conclusions of the workshops and then introduce our panellists and moderate the discussions. Thanks, Sonia.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I think those were some fantastic opening remarks, and fully agree that we need that predictability of adaptation finance so that countries can plan, and also really exciting to think that some of the ideas that we'll be discussing today could indeed be made real by COP28 Dubai, which is going to be a COP obviously also focused very much on adaptation. So as I said, my name's Sonia Dunlop. I'm the program lead at E3G, a climate change think tank working on public banks and MDBs. And I just want to spend a few minutes to briefly summarize and present to you the outputs of the technical workshops that we've been holding with colleagues from across the multilateral development banks on this topic. Sorry. I now have the necessary technology. So just to say, E3G as a word of introduction stands for Third Generation Environmentalism. We're an independent climate change think tank working to accelerate the transition to a climate-safe world. And for us, climate safety is very much both about mitigation and adaptation. We have offices all over the world. We deliver outcomes with partnerships with all different kinds of governments and NGOs and others. And we're funded primarily through philanthropic foundations, such as the Gates Foundation over there on our panel, but also through government funding as well. And we've been ranked the 5th most influential environmental think tank in the world. So our goal in terms of our work on public development banks, on multilateral development banks, is very much thinking about all 500 public banks around the world and thinking about how they can all become transformational leaders of the transition to climate safety. So we don't just work on multilateral development banks, we really work on all public banks in our public banks program. And we've been convening this series of workshops online with colleagues across the multilateral development banks, made possible by the UK FCDO, to focus on 3 very specific angles. We wanted to be very concrete, very specific angles to end the MDB adaptation finance. We first looked at how we can mainstream sustainable and efficient cooling technologies, also reducing the need for cooling as a way of responding to the extreme heat involved in climate change, and in specifically looking at buildings. We then went broader and we said, okay, what are the innovative financial instruments that we could use for adaptation finance in general? And then we looked again at some very topical issue, which is the issue of how to mainstream adaptation in MDB work on agriculture and food security. And this event is very much the culmination of all that work, the concluding event here at COP27. But we hope this is not the end, but the beginning of a conversation and a process to try and put some of these ideas into action. On cooling in particular, now cooling, may seem like a niche issue, but it really isn't. The extreme heat challenge is going to be absolutely critical all over the world over the next few decades. We're going to see cooling demand triple by 2050. This isn't just about buildings, it's about agriculture, it's about food, about medical cold chains, food cold chains. It's about off-grid cooling, district cooling, it's about urban planning and greening and reducing that need for cooling, and it's about transport. And by the way, I think it's very ironic that we're holding this event in a temporary building that is overcooled in many ways, and we'll come to that as well. But this requires the need to really focus on intermediated finance to spread this best practice throughout the financial system so that sustainable and efficient cooling becomes part of all financial decisions, and also to integrate sustainable and efficient cooling in all parts of MDB operations, to include it as an automatic consideration in all buildings and agribusiness and transport loans, for example. And this is also an area that really requires early stage support and funding, and we came up with some brilliant examples of that. We then spent some time talking about what are the different innovative financial instruments, what could the MDBs do together in order to scale up adaptation finance. And there we talked about how there was a real need to crowd in more private investment for adaptation, very much a priority, how we can look at results-based financing models, and some of the panelists are going to say more about that, climate resilient debt clauses, meso-financing, especially in the area of agriculture, and sustainability-linked financial instruments. And then we focus very much on agriculture and food security, which is an area that's particularly vulnerable to climate impacts, and where we really need to build not just project by project resilience, but systems level resilience. And there we really looked at how project preparation facilities could help on this front, how microfinance could help deliver finance to the vast majority of farmers around the world that are smallholder farmers, and how we can integrate nature-based solutions into the MDB operations in agribusiness. We have put forward to the panel and to you here 2 papers today, and I have copies here. One input paper summarizing what came out of these workshops. Very keen to get comments. We'll be publishing that in the next few weeks. And a pilot paper with a very specific proposal that we are making coming out of this work for a joint MDB and DFI facility, possibly with IDFC, on sustainable and efficient cooling and how that can be mainstreamed across all operations as one of the ideas for new facilities and instruments that coming out of this process. So that's the summary of where we got to in our discussions. And so with that in mind, and with a sort of forward view to COP28 Dubai as well, I want to turn to our panel, who are going to give us their views on this as well. And we can keep the slide up with the names of the panelists. Thank you very much. So as I said, the focus has very much been on innovative adaptation finance, innovative MDB adaptation finance. And so I'm really keen to hear from our panelists as to what they think we need on this front from their different perspectives. So Diane, if I could maybe turn to you first, if that's okay. Diane Blacklane, you're the Director of the Environment Department in Antigua and Barbuda, also Climate Ambassador. And I'm very keen to hear from you what you think the MDBs can do to be more targeted in their adaptation finance, and what you would expect in terms of adaptation finance as Antigua and Barbuda in order to really address the challenge that's needed. Diane, over to you.
Okay. Thank you so much for inviting me. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. So as you know, I'm from a small island developing state, very tiny, and we we negotiate here as very small islands. And small islands are not the favorite, we're not the best clients of NDBs because we're so small. And of course, the smaller it is, the transaction costs are also small. And so we normally get overlooked with respect to climate financing. Secondly, we get overlooked for another reason, which is I think is the biggest reason, is that it costs twice as much for an adaptation project in Antigua and Barbuda or any island. Okay. Than it's like, let's say in Kenya. And it has nothing to do with being a least developed country or a developing country in Kenya. It has to do with most islands. It's like it has that last mile feature where everything has to be shipped to one place, collected, and then shipped to the last mile. So when we talk about the vulnerability of small island developing states, this is one of the issues, is that when we get damaged by a hurricane or drought, it costs twice as much to fix it. So we sent a project to the Green Climate Fund, to Adaptation Project, and they had a new staff member with something that happens in some of the funds, and they said, oh, you know, the internal rate of return for this project is crazy. There's no way we'll fund it. And I said, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I was not talking to a bank. We are talking to a fund. And, you know, they had to double back on what they're saying. But that is the reality of working in a small island developing state. But what do we do in my department, knowing all of that? So it's really easy for small island developing states because of the high cost, the high risk, and to be in debt very quickly. So we hit our debt ceiling really quickly compared to another country, similar size, similar population, and so we're not able to borrow anymore. So when we're sitting next to the MDBs, I'm like, let me just keep quiet because we're not a client for them. However, I think another issue with the MDBs is that microfinancing, it will be the king and queen of how we finance things in small island states. And microfinancing is not something that MDBs find very attractive. They cannot manage the risk. They don't have the patience for it. But it's one of the areas that they can mobilize the private sector in a small island developing states or even an LDC, compared to going directly and working directly with the ministries of finance, where they have their debt ceiling that they hit and so on. So that is not something that they do really well. So I'm glad to hear that you talk about it. And ecosystem-based adaptation is not something that MDBs do very well either. So my recommendation and suggestions to the MDBs is that, so what we did to, this is not limited to MDBs, this is limited to the global environmental facilities and so on. And I see Dauda here, formerly from the Adaptation Fund. And we at the Department of Environment put forward to the Adaptation Fund a project to do microfinancing. And at first they weren't very keen, but eventually now they're really keen on it. And what they found is that the programming of funding compared to like a project with the government or with a government agency or with microfinancing, whether it's microloans or microgrants, the microfinancing through the NGO or the private sector moves a lot faster, which is what most banks want to see, that you get the money, you spend the money, and you see impacts really short time. So a project to do like a EBA project in a government, in my government, may take 4 years, maybe 5 years. If the same project in the same location done by NGO or by a farmer would take less than 18 months. And they do it well. But of course, they don't report like the way we would like to report. And when we look at the way that we write our reports for the Adaptation Fund, it's not bad. But the Green Climate Fund is as if you're writing a thesis for a PhD. Only 5% of the people in the world write like that, think like that. We don't speak like that. And so if you're working with microfinance and with farmers and so on, which you're absolutely right, change takes place there. If a government does something high up, they don't understand what is happening and they will keep undo whatever the work is. But we have to be able to take a report in a format of the language of the people that you're providing the financing. And I'll just end by saying that in my department, when we're trying to think how to engage persons and so on, we would say, like, you know, what would Google do? You know, what would Tesla do to mobilize people to buy electric cars or use solar panels or provide data or provide reports? And we ask ourselves the question and the answer comes. In other words, what we're saying is that the answer that you need to engage at that level is already there. It's being done in the private sector extremely well. We just have to be open to the idea. And yes, it is high risk. And I remember the entity, my partner entity in South Africa, we both had our projects together. Hers is still going, mine is finished. So she asked me what happened. I said, you look like you're being pecked to death by chickens. That is microfinancing. It's like being pecked to death by chicken, one after the other. And I said, you gotta have to focus what you want to do with them, pick your battles, and do 3 things, and that's it. If you decide you're gonna do everything, you're gonna be stressed out, and you will never finish. So that has been our experience, and I wish the MDBs could openly consider working in this space. It is a bottom-up approach that's going to get us where we want to go, and it takes a small amount of money to make a big change at that level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. I like that very much. Sorry, we're having some technical problems here. And I love that. The new what would Jesus do is what would Google do. Let's all ask ourselves, what would Google do, or what would Elon Musk do? Maybe not that one. And then do act accordingly. Thank you, Diane. Thank you. Next, I want to turn to Gareth Phillips. You're the Climate and Environment Finance Manager at African Development Bank, working on adaptation, on forestry, on land use, so lots of areas of expertise that are very relevant to this. You've been involved in coming up with some innovative ideas on how to get money to that last mile for adaptation. What do you think we need to do on this front, and what does African Development Bank have in store to try and address this challenge? Gareth.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. I hope you can hear me okay. We have some difficulty hearing on the panel here, but I hope you can hear as well. So thank you very much. I'd like to address this issue about mobilizing finance from the private sector, quite specifically focusing on that. What we've realized at the African Development Bank is that adaptation projects are typically small scale and context specific. And that means that the financing mechanisms, the architecture that we have, mobilizing resources from international climate finance funds and so on, it doesn't really work for adaptation, because we have often micro, small and medium enterprises or communities or cooperatives that need to implement projects maybe at $1 million or $2 million. They can't talk to the African Development Bank or to the Green Climate Fund to mobilize that kind of money. There are apparently an estimated 44 million micro, small and medium enterprises in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if even 1% of those wanted to do something with climate finance, that's 500,000 projects, counterparties to work with. You know, we can't cope with those kinds of things. And what we learned from this is that the instruments we have are just not appropriate for the challenge. And really that explains why we're not making progress on adaptation finance. We're still stuck at less than 5% of climate finance in Africa being spent on adaptation. So it was Einstein who said, you know, it's a sign of madness if you keep on doing the same thing and expect to get a different result. So we have to change. And Debbie, you asked us to think differently. And, you know, this is what we're doing. So we've come up with a mechanism called the Adaptation Benefits Mechanism. And my problem is I always try to get too technical in describing this. So I'm going to try and keep it really simple this time. It's a bit like we see at the moment a huge demand for voluntary carbon credits now, because suddenly the corporate world has woken up to carbon offsetting again. And they want to spend money buying emission reductions to offset their targets, offset their emissions. What we want them to do instead is to say, well, we'd like to adopt a positive adaptation target, or we'd like to invest in making our supply chain climate resilient. So instead of spending money on purchasing emission reductions, we would like to invite the corporate sector, the private sector, philanthropies in developed countries to commit to purchase what we're calling certified adaptation benefits. Now, the adaptation benefit mechanism has the project cycle to create these certified adaptation benefits. And I won't go into the detail of that because that's where it gets very technical. But there are two things that come out of this project cycle. The first is a registered project document. So that is effectively an appraised document that's been through an independent evaluation process that says it's good using an approved methodology. That's the first thing they need. And the second thing is they need a signed supply agreement with a credit-worthy purchaser. So that's like an offtake agreement or a purchase agreement that says if you deliver the goods, I'll pay you. We want to get as many registered project activity or project documents as we can and put them in the adaptation supermarket and invite corporates to come and browse the shelves and pick the projects that they like and negotiate the price that they're willing to pay for those adaptation benefits. And the adaptation benefits are outputs, outcomes and impacts from adaptation projects. They're all different. It's not like emission reductions, which are fungible. Certified adaptation benefits are not fungible. Every one is different because it's context specific. So you don't have that sort of commoditization aspect. But once the project developer has a registered document and a supply agreement, then they can go to a local commercial bank, to a green bank or an MDB and borrow the money that they need to implement the project. We'll lend them the money, we'll put guarantees in place, that will be the MDB's role, and they will then implement the project. Most of them will succeed and deliver certified adaptation benefits, which they'll give to their purchaser, they'll get the money back and they'll pay back the loan. So that's how the mechanism works, and that's how we think we can stimulate developed country private sector actors to put money into the process that will then stimulate the activity from the developing country private sector actors. That's the micro, small and medium enterprises. And we envisage literally thousands of bilateral agreements between developed country partners, funds, donors, philanthropies and so on, and the project developers on site. And often people say, well, what about the transaction costs? And for sure, small-scale projects have transaction costs. But one of the interesting things about this as a non-market approach and the fact that we're not creating a commodity is that those transaction costs get internalized into the price that the purchaser pays. You're not competing on price. You're not looking for the cheapest adaptation benefit, which is what happened in the carbon markets where you look for the cheapest credits. But in the adaptation space, you're looking for a story. You're looking for something that you want to pay for, that you like, that you're associated with for one reason or another, and you pay a fair price for that. It's not necessarily the cheapest price, but we have transparency mechanisms that will ensure you get value for money. And in that way, we think we can mobilize significant amounts of private sector finance into the adaptation space. And as we heard again from Debbie about the governments, the donors who are doubling, tripling, quadrupling the amount of adaptation finance that's available, and we think that we can mobilize that money using the adaptation benefits mechanism. So I hope I didn't get too technical, and I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much. Oh, no, one more. Dauda is the co-chair of the methodology panel and is a member of the ABM executive committee. So we have partnership, and EBRD have recently just agreed that they're going to partner with us to develop the adaptation benefits mechanism further. Thank you very much.
There we go, a great example of multilateral development banks working together to make things happen. And Gareth, I love the idea of your adaptation supermarket. We will look forward to the new Walmart of adaptation, the Gareth Phillips brand of the adaptation supermarket. And I'm sure there will be lots of clients coming around to shop around for the right adaptation projects for them. Thank you so much. Dauda, I'd like to come to you next. You are the lead climate expert at the Islamic Development Bank, a South-South MDB, so very special position. You are also the co-chair of the joint MDB adaptation working group, so very much in a leadership position on this and able to speak for all 10 of the MDBs. And so it'd be really interesting to hear from you what you see as options in terms of Islamic finance, but also in terms of what the MDBs can do together in this space to help, bring the adaptation needed to the market. Dauda, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. So, yes, we all agree that the current level of adaptation finance, when you compare it with mitigation finance, is there is still room for improvement. But I think the idea of looking, thinking outside the box and looking at new innovative ways of financing adaptation, those are maybe areas where MDBs can take the lead in identifying, piloting, showing that it could work, and then scale up a few mechanisms, a few innovations. So I will talk about Islamic finance. Islamic finance is, I think, now has been quite mainstreamed. If you look at the flows of Islamic finance worldwide right now, back in 2020, it was estimated at around $4 trillion. So it's really something that that is being quite used globally. But when you look at it, you could see us as an MDB, the way we are even mobilizing resources through bonds and the Islamic equivalent, which is called sukuk. So the bank has had a few sukuks for quite some time now, but not long ago the bank had its first green sukuk being established under a sustainable finance framework that the bank had developed, and it was quite successful. Those are areas where, of course, the bank is able to mobilize resources, and these resources are used for the regular projects where we have our own climate finance target, etc., etc. But now, when we look at potential now for Islamic finance products, I can give a few examples. You know, Islamic social financing, for they have different types. You have charity, I would call sadaqa, which is the name in Arabic, which is normal charity, okay? And then you have something that looks like a tax on each Muslim people who can afford it, that you have to give a slight of your wealth as as a contribution to the community, which is called zakat. So this is done on an annual basis, and the estimate of zakat globally was estimated a few years ago at $300 billion that are given away through zakat. And then you have something called waqf, which is a sort of endowment, uh, philanthropic financing, and through waqf you can provide the seed funding for example, a real estate, and revenues from that real estate can be used ad vitam aeternam, hopefully, for activities that go to foundations, etc. So if you look at the potential for these types of financing, uh, and looking at the vulnerable communities where this financing is going, uh, there is room for financing adaptation and room for financing clean energy, low-cost clean energy supplies. So, a few examples, the Islamic Development Bank has established, along with UNICEF, a global Muslim philanthropy fund, which is looking at supporting uh, humanitarian aid for children, but also uh, life-saving activities that are linked with the SDGs. So this could include as well SDG 13. uh, the bank has also established a WAF property investment fund. So this fund is this fund receives financing from from philanthropists, and the fund supports projects by Muslim associations investing in properties. So there is an example in the Emirates, where there is an association that has established um, a big real estate residence, where you have residential and commercial areas, and the proceeding from that big building are going to a foundation that is supporting activities. So these are activities where you have really a huge, big potential, and that is being piloted or operationalized through some of these examples. Lastly, I would like to mention the microfinance that you are talking about, and where uh, we all know what are the issues sometimes with microfinance. Very high interest rates, huge, and it's supposed to go to the communities. So there are some Islamic finance institutions, and the ISDB is has also section that is supporting microfinance institutions. So by combining Islamic social financing, going to the microfinance institution, that financing supports the administrative costs of the Islamic microfinance institution, helping in decreasing the interest rate for those vulnerable communities. So these are a few examples. You can also see the fintech, the Islamic fintech, that is being more and more operationalized as well, supporting platforms, online platforms, where you have philanthropist donors coming to support foundations that are implementing projects that can be as well labeled as adaptation. So these are a few examples of instruments that are being operationalized. Thanks.
The technology has died and it's only Thursday of week one. Thank you so much, Dauda. That was really interesting, especially what you said about your partnership with UNICEF, because of course, when we think about the human impact of climate impacts, you know, it's often the very oldest and the very youngest who are going to bear the brunt of that. There was a group of pediatricians that came to COP26 Glasgow to make just that point, and we have to bear that in mind. But great to hear that Islamic finance can be such a fantastic source of finance for this. Great. So, and we'll come back to some of those points in the discussion. But next, I wanted to turn to Dr. Purvi Mehta from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us. You are the Director for Agriculture and Climate, specifically looking at Asia in the foundation, one of the biggest philanthropic foundations in the world. It'd be really interesting to hear how you think philanthropy can come and, with your innovative mindset, can come and add to this world, and what you think the contribution of philanthropy could be, and how you think multilateral development banks can work with you perhaps to bring some of that innovation to this space. But also keen to hear from you, with your agricultural expertise, what you think needs to happen to make climate smart agriculture a reality, and make sure that all MDB and DFI operations really promote that from the very bottom to the very top. Dr. Mehta, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Can you hear me there? No?
Maybe bring it closer. You can hold it up. Yeah, bring it closer. Oh, look, Frederick will hold it for you.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? No? Is this? No. You should have used your mic.
I think if the lights.
Yeah. Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. There
Yeah,
we go.
thank you,
Just speak
thank you.
as close as possible to the microphone.
Okay. We had a competition between two mics, so thank you. Thank you, Sonia. And it's really great to hear from the MDBs. I think MDBs have really stepped up to become one of the biggest and one of the most powerful climate finance mechanism. And you know, it's really very interesting to see the different business models that you all spoke about, and the way the various MDBs are now collaborating and working together. I think that's also extremely important. Last COP in Glasgow played an extremely important role in bringing that pivot and attention to adaptation. Till then, and that is changing now, but till then, close to 80–85% of the efforts in climate or climate finance was going towards mitigation, and that shift to adaptation, the shift to action, is something that that was a huge contribution from last COP. To your question on what philanthropies can do, I think while MDBs play an extremely important role, we must all realize that it is not a silver bullet. Right, and I think there are a very large number of other financing mechanisms. There are a very large number of other complementarities and efforts that is required along with the funding that the MDBs bring. And what do I mean by complementarity? Here are some examples, and you just asked me to bring in some agriculture examples into it also. The complementarities from non-MDBs like us, for example, can come in many ways. Number one is in how the finance is managed. We know that there are major gaps between what is required as adaptation and or climate finance and what is available right now, right? If one looks at this continent, Africa, if Africa wants to sort of deliver on the NDCs between 2020 and 2030, which is the target, right? The required funding is going to be about $2.8 trillion, right? So in 10 years, Africa requires $2.8 trillion, which roughly means, and I'm very mindful that I'm sitting with bankers, so my numbers can be wrong, but that roughly means about $288 billion a year. What is the present situation? The present situation is Africa receives about $29 billion. Right? So there are major gaps, and one realizes that there is a major gap between what is required and what is available. But it's not just the what is important is not just to say how much money is available. It is also very important to say where that money needs to be spent, and there are major differences there. So the amount of spending in Africa that we see right now, only about 10 countries in Africa draws more than half of that money, right? Very similar kind of major gaps also come in various sectors. Within agriculture, for example, you know, less than 2% of the real money is reaching out to the smallholder farmer, for example, right? Among that, less than 0.5% of the money goes to, say, for example, a large sector like adaptation in livestock. And we know it is such an important sector. And so there are major gaps between countries getting the funding. There are major gaps between the sectors within the financial need that are there. I think people like us, and there are many, so we are no exclusive organization or anything like that, but the non-MDBs, to answer your question, can play a role in creating that infrastructure, in capacitating those countries and those sectors and those stakeholders, and making them investment ready for MDBs to really reach out. Because as someone said, you know, the scale is really very, very important. So we can play a very important role in bridging that gap. Today, 46 countries, for example, have their national adaptation plan ready. You know, can we use that mechanism to keep them ready and almost like business propositions from that? The second would be the role the non-MDBs can play is in terms of innovation, right? See, as a world, our understanding on the severity of the problem, we have come a long way in understanding the severity of the problem, right? But we still are in a very, very nascent stage in really knowing what are the concrete ground level solutions. And therefore, creating those evidences of what works and creating those scalable, affordable solutions which then can be invested in would be very, very important, right? So here's a solution, here's what worked in Kenya and in Uganda, and this is how it, this is the return on investment it created, and creating that, that for the MDBs to then come and invest into and scale. And that also to the earlier point on private sector, right? Today the private sector finance is about 10 to 12%, right? There are tremendous opportunities, not only as CSR. I don't think CSR is the only way. It's also, there are a lot of opportunities in domestic financing, in many of those things. And I think blended finance can play a very, very important role. So I often say, you know, stacking all the innovations and blending the finance. This would be a very, very interesting way of doing that. And non-MDBs like us can play that catalytic role. So two things broadly, Sonia, to answer your question. Number one is creating that economy of scope. And number two is creating that economy of scale to make those investable, impactful investment, because at the end I'd like to say that finance is extremely, extremely important, but finance is not the end. Finance is a means to an end, and the end is in impact at scale, and there's where we could play a role together.
Absolutely, and that's so interesting, you know, the idea that you could come in and get some pilots going that then MDBs could bring and then scale up. You know, that's just the kind of pipeline that we want to build for ideas. Also great, you know, your idea that every national adaptation plan needs a financing plan to go with it. That's what we need to be building here through the country platforms and so on. And you outline the adaptation finance gap so clearly. You know, there's 2.8 trillion needs, 288 billion a year being needed, and 29 billion being received, climate finance in general. Debbie from FCDO mentioned that obviously the MDBs, and congratulations on this, have already met the projections for adaptation finance for 2025 last year, the 18 billion you predicted in 2019. Obviously nobody knows how that will develop, but just in terms of the numbers, E3G, our rough estimate is that could maybe be at 21 billion by 2025. That's just our estimate in terms of total MDB adaptation finance, just to give you an idea. But that brings us to our last panelist, Frederick from Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that you're busy in the negotiating rooms over in the other building, so thank you for taking the time out. If you need to leave, that's fine. Frederick Auma, you are the climate negotiator for the government of Kenya, and also you work for Transparency International, which must make Kenya the most transparent government in the world. What do you think we need here in this room to unlock the negotiations in the other rooms over there? Does what happens in this room have impact over there? The correct answer is yes. And what would you like to see in terms of Kenya from this process, and what innovative finance would really make the difference for you? Frederick, over to you.
Thank you, Sonia. Am I audible? Good. So, actually, I wish I was sitting in the audience because I have a lot of questions for the MDBs and the philanthropists.
You can ask
but
questions as well, that's okay.
I find myself in a very tricky situation, but let me try. You have already had circumstances about Africa. The reality is that we are dealing in a context where the vulnerability of our countries has moved from bad to worse over the past few years due to COVID-19 and other climate-related disasters. You have 20 out of about 26 most vulnerable countries coming from Africa. You have countries in Africa or yet developing countries in general who are struggling with debt. Most have hit their debt ceilings and are struggling to increase it, and it's already too much. You have a global economy where inflation is disrupting economies left, right, and center. I was here at the start of October in Alexandria. The dollar was 19 Egyptian pound. Over 4 weeks, it's today 24. Before we leave, it might be 25. That is already having its own impacts in these countries. You have the Paris Agreement now, which is why we are talking about this within the context of the COP, that says any development moving from now onwards has to align with sustainable development, has to ensure we are able to eradicate poverty, but also has to ensure that we are building, we are increasing the ability of countries to adapt to the negative impacts of climate change in a low emission development trajectory. And then you have the MDBs, who, by the way, we are currently talking about in negotiations, because we have a common understanding for the first time that we need to reform the MDBs a little bit, since we think that they are more or less operating like private entities today. I mean, since we started from Philips coming, we are only talking about investment. Even in philanthropic cases, we are talking about, Dawood has said they have a philanthropy fund which is putting money in investments. Yet we have a poverty situation that might not align well with investments. And Phillips put it very well, that the circumstance of adaptation is not palatable for the MDBs. Yet, the trillions we need must actually go to adaptation to build resilience and increase the adaptive capacity of these communities. Because even for you to put an investment and have people who are going to buy your products, those people must be people who have the ability to purchase. And the ability to purchase means that you have enhanced their resilience and they have some pocket change to go and invest and buy something. So let me come to Sonia's question, which is not the question I enjoy the most when we talk about innovative financing in adaptation. It's actually a question we wouldn't even tolerate in the other side of this COP when we are negotiating finance, because we don't want to talk about innovation in financing adaptation. But I see a lot of opportunity for the development, for the multilateral development banks. And I'll give you an example, Phillips. In Kenya, the World Bank has two main projects running. One of them is Kenya Climate Smart Agriculture Project. Another one is the Financing Locally Led Climate Action Project. These are projects that are technically climate change, but in the negotiation lens, development projects. And that is because if you look at Kenya's NDC, Kenya defines climate finance as anything other than a loan. But these are resources, these are what we call concessional loans. So when Kenya reports its support received, it will not report the two projects. But in my practice lens, these are projects that are actually building the resilience of communities and actually financing adaptation. And therefore, I see a very big opportunity in the MDB's development work to actually put a lot of financing in projects and programs that are actually going to enhance the resilience of local communities. As to whether there will be the debt space to accommodate them, that is something that country and MDBs can engage in, but I believe that the level of concessionality that a loan comes with could basically make it easier to absorb or for our treasuries to underwrite those particular risks. So I see a situation where every development and every MDB financing is going to be about climate change. There is nothing an MDB is going to put money into that is not going to be either mitigation or adaptation as we go into 2022, 2023. And the question every country is going to be asked, if Kenya is selling flowers in the EU market, they're going to be asked whether the flowers are Paris Agreement aligned, whether the carbon footprint of those flowers were aligned properly with the goals that we have set in the Paris Agreement. So the 18 billion is what I don't consider as an achievement, even though MDB say they've overachieved their target. And it's good you are transparent. I just Googled MDB's contribution for climate change adaptation, and I realized it's 35% in your 2021 report. But it is time that we started understanding that there is nothing that MDBs are going to put money into that is not going to be either mitigation or adaptation. The question is, how are MDBs going to define adaptation, and how are they going to define mitigation? The other question is also whether they have the appetite to consider non-dollar benefits from an investment. Because we have programs that would not require a debt per se, but economists would basically give you a dollar value benefit of those projects and programs. And as we discuss about innovative financing for adaptation, these are options that we need to start exploring as we test ground with grant-based financing from MDBs for climate change adaptation. I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Frederick, and all really good points. Yes, please, round of applause. And everyone in the audience and those online, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask questions, so please start thinking about your questions. But in a way, you've named one of the elephants in the room, Frederick, MDB reform. You're saying it's being discussed in the negotiating rooms. I'd like to ask Dauda to address some of those points, both the point about how do we define adaptation finance, because I know the MDBs have been doing a lot of work on that this year with the new methodology. Is it already published or not quite yet? I can't remember. Not yet, but it's coming, right? It's coming. We hope so. We hope so. Inshallah, inshallah. But also, you know, MDB reform is on the cards. We know that the G7 and a number of other countries have asked for an evolution roadmap from the World Bank by Christmas. Daoud, do you think the MDBs do need to change the way they think to meet this challenge? And how can we think about the definitions of adaptation finance to make sure we're hitting not just the quantity, but the quality as well? Dauda.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we know that it's a dynamic process, you know. Adaptation has the concepts, the science of adaptation has been evolving, you know, and the adaptation finance tracking methodology of the MDBs was developed quite a few years ago. And what we wanted to do was to look at it now, review it based on changes that have happened. Um, you have the EU taxonomy that came. You have the different work that has been done with the climate funds. You have the new financial instruments that the MDBs have been developing. So we wanted to really review the methodology, looking at all these different elements. And so the result we got from our discussion was that for the direct financing, we see more and more three categories of investments. So the first one is making sure that we are making our investments resilient. So we look at projects, and we look at the physical climate risks that are coming, and that could affect those different projects, and we add that element of resilience into the investment. And the second category is investment that have a clear objective of addressing adaptation and resilience. That could be in terms of supporting research, that could be in terms of creating adaptation solutions directly through the projects, or it could be projects that are coming maybe from those adaptation plans that you were mentioning, and investment plans, where it's clearly about adapting, and that's where the money is going. So this is a second category of investment. And then you have a third category, which is kind of in the middle. You have these development projects that have dual objective, right? They have a development objective, but they also have clearly an adaptation objective, especially when it's about these climate sensitive sectors, such as agriculture, water, all of those. So that's the third category of projects that we have identified. And for each of those, we have established kind of a way to identify climate finance within these three categories. So we are going one step ahead compared with the way we were doing it in the past, and we hope that starting 2023, when we report on our 2023 financing, we will start using that updated methodology.
Brilliant, and it's great to hear you've done so much work on that, and thank you to you and all the other MDBs. I want to also now turn to this idea that, Gareth, you presented, the adaptation benefits mechanism, and I won't come to you because I want to actually ask Diane. You heard the ideas that Gareth presented, this adaptation supermarket of projects trying to take the non-dollar benefits that Frederick mentioned and give them a dollar value in the end. Was that one way of describing it, right? Diane, I'd like to know if the IDB, if the World Bank, if the Caribbean Development Bank created or joined such a similar mechanism, do you think that's something that would really work for you and the projects you see in Antigua and Barbuda?
Okay, so once the MDBs are evolving, they have to really work on their image. When you think supermarket, you don't think MDBs. When you think innovation, you don't think MDBs. When you think access to financing, you don't think MDBs, right? Even Kenya can say that. No, we won't do that. There's something like crowd financing, which is much easier for some countries, some persons to do. But I'm not saying there's no rule for it. I think it's great. If it works in Africa, that would be something that would be really good. So that's fine. But in countries like mine and many smaller and developing states, we actually have a lot of capital in our local banks. that we can't program. And so for us, we would use any funding that we would get from a philanthropic organization or from the GEF, the GCF, or even the MDBs. We've been trying to get our Ministry of Finance to use MDB funding to help get those money circulated into the economy. And right now the banks stay afloat by charging a lot of fees. And we see that the opportunity of transitioning our economy as an opportunity to grow our, the business with our banks. So I think that is more where we're looking forward to. The banks know our space, they know our people, but they're not too sure on the risk and how to, like for example, to purchase a solar panel kit for a home. They have no clue what that is. Absolutely no clue. And I listened to the representative, sorry I don't remember, from Bill Gates and Foundation, and it is Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and it is really true. We kind of know there's an emergency, but not really ready to act. So I think when the consumer is ready to act, we cannot, as wonderful as the banks are, they will not be responsive. We have to get our private banks, our credit organization ready to spend money, to know how to spend money, and have the information ready to know this product is not damaging the environment, this product is truly green and not greenwashing. So I think that is the approach we're really taking now, and we're hoping that the MDBs can get into that space if they want to, because even though they don't want to be in that space, there's a lot of work for them to do. In the traditional area financing, there's a lot of work for them to do there. So for us to bridge the gaps, the financing, if we have to bring the financing from our local banks into that climate space.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Diane, and thank you. And I have lots more questions, and we need to come to our closing remarks, but I just want to ask if anyone in the room has any questions for the panelists. Would anyone like to stand up and ask a question? Welcome, please take a seat. Would anyone like to stand up and ask a question? Or if someone online would like to type it into the chat and we can somehow get that. Surely, look up from your iPhones, look up from your laptops. Yes, Ade, would you like to ask a question? And perhaps if you take this one here, I think that's, unless the technical personnel give me another option. Here, Ade, over to you.
Thank you very much, panel. That was all very enlightening. And I'm interested to know kind of what can we take away from here? What can kind of happen next? And with that in mind, I'll just reflect on something that Selwyn Hart said this morning at an event in this very hall. He said that the way the system is set up, MDBs are not incentivized to work together. They're incentivized to work in silos. So they are rewarded for their individual efforts. And so I have two questions. The first is, if you could work better together, collaborate better, maybe, you know, as the ABM is being you've got the ISDB and the EIB cooperating on the ABM, which sounds brilliant. There aren't enough examples of that. My question is, do you think that would make a difference to how we can transform and scale up adaptation finance? And then my second question, therefore, is related, and it's what kind of incentives do we have to change to make this more likely in future that MDBs would work together and collaborate?
Thank you so much, Ade. And Gareth, maybe I can suggest, as Dawood has always had a second word, if you could take that question of you know, how can we incentivize MDBs to work together?
Yes, okay, thank you very much. Well, actually, we do work very well together, particularly in the climate change space. We have a very active group of MDBs working on climate change, and I mean, that's evidenced by the fact that we're here together in a joint pavilion holding joint events. So, you know, we do a lot. And working on the methodologies and the you know, the Paris alignment work. So I think there's a lot that we can take from that. I think that, you know, in terms of making a difference, and this maybe goes back to the last question, the comments about the climate finance as well. You know, we mobilized in our report we reported $51 billion of climate finance, which speaker I can't remember said if $280 billion a year is what we require. You know, actually the MDBs mobilize a relatively small amount of the total amount, and we're not going to channel all that finance. what is important is the enabling environments, the additional things that we do that enable much greater levels of finance to be mobilized. So, you know, it's great to look at that we report and are transparent about the amount of money that we mobilize, that we actually channel through our books. But what matters is the additional things that we do. And I know that as the MDBs, we want to move that narrative on from focusing on the amount of money that we actually mobilize to focusing on the much greater contribution that we make to the creation of the enabling environment. And there, you know, we do work very well together. And, you know, there's examples, for example, from the climate investment funds where we work together on the development of investment plans, the JETP in South Africa, where we're working together to mobilize, what is it, $60 billion of finance that we need to mobilize for that program. We're working on that together. So really, I think the sum of what we do is much greater than the sum of our parts. And, you know, we will continue to do that. And, you know, we hear the message coming that we need to reform, and you know, we understand that. And, you know, we will work with our shareholders and our regional member countries, and we will learn from each other as we do that. Let me stop there.
Great. So message received then. Fantastic. Are there any more questions from anyone in the room? We must have one more question, then we're going to bring in Mr. Vice President there. Any questions? Anyone? Someone must have a question. Who would like to ask a question? Perhaps of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Any ideas for projects there? I will pick on someone. Who can I pick on? Yes? You want to ask a question? Here you are. Here's the microphone. Testing, testing, yes.
You seem to have the magic touch, unlike me. I was a little bit late, so forgive me if this was covered at the beginning, but for the people on the panel, but also specifically for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I'm curious about how you're safeguarding best practice for where this funding is being directed. Once you get past the mobilization question, how are you ensuring that this mobilized funding is getting to the best possible directions and is being at the best possible level of best practice? Thank you.
So, our funding, say for example in agriculture, right? The end user for us or the client for us is a smallholder farmers in any. So the way we look at it is any investment that we do must contribute towards four things. One is productivity of the farmer. Second is income of the farmer, because higher productivity by default doesn't mean that the income will be higher. So just because the farmer produced more doesn't mean the income went higher, right? So productivity, income. The third is the household nutrition level, and fourth big area that we invest in is women farmers. So that's our matrix and that's our indicator, and that's the reason when I said we could play a very complementary role to some of the larger MDB type programs as well. So.
Thank you so much. There we go, it's working. Thank you. Frederick, I will come back to you, but I just see that Mr. Kevin Kariuki from the African Development Bank, Vice President for Climate, has come in. So if you would like to come and deliver some remarks, thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to have you here. And what your thoughts are in terms of what the MDBs can do on adaptation and innovative solutions and innovative financial instruments on adaptation. Thank you, Mr. Kariuki. Over to you.
Hello, well done. Thank you very much. First of all, I'll start by addressing a question that was addressed by was asked by that gentleman and responded to by Gareth. First of all, when it comes to MDBs working together, I will first of all address myself to the recent principles and recommendations of the task force, of the UK task force on access to climate finance. We've participated in this particular event. We've participated in a number of meetings associated with this project, and I can confirm that on behalf of the Asia Development Bank, on behalf of the Africa Development Bank that I represent, and on behalf of the European Investment Bank, we actually find that the principles and recommendations that have been made by the task force are indeed consistent and aligned with our goals and priorities of increasing access to climate finance. The only thing we could not be able to do before we came to the COP27 was to agree on signing off, because we need to go through the process of discussing with our internal stakeholders before we get back to you. But we are very confident that in a short period of time, we'll come and sign off on those principles and recommendations. That was my first message. The second message is what you've just asked me, and this relates to how we can be able to mobilize significant climate finance. First of all, I need to contextualize. The bank on its own has committed to mobilizing or to allocating 40% of its annual lending program on climate finance. And last year we surpassed that target, and we did 41%. And more importantly, of that 41%, we allocated 67% of that climate finance as adaptation finance, which translated to about $1.5 billion. So in absolute terms, it's not significant, but it is indicative of the level and commitment that the bank has. And it's for that reason that understanding, for example, that the needs for climate finance in Africa are upwards of $125 billion per year, all through to 2030, we have decided as a bank to find ways of increasing access to climate finance. And that's why, especially adaptation finance, and that's why last year, I forgot to mention that of that 41% of our total investment, over a period of 5-6 years, we were hoping to raise $25 billion, of which half of it would be adaptation finance. But we realized that that is not adequate for the continent. So we went out of our way, and last year, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, we committed to double our adaptation finance. First of all, the half of the 25 billion I talked about will be granted. And then we raised, together with the Global Center on Adaptation, we raised an additional $12.5 billion. So we are hoping to raise a total of $25 billion between 2020 and 2025, purely for adaptation. And then based on that, but then we also realized again last year that even with that, we need more adaptation resources. And that's why last year, as part of the work, the new climate change and green growth policy that we established, we actually set out to help Africa increase access to climate finance from the current 3%, because that's all Africa accounts for. To date, Africa accounts for only 3% of global climate finance, works out to about $20 billion a year. So we set out that we are going to help Africa increase its access to climate finance from 3% to 10%. But when we looked at the overall needs, we actually realized that that's not even enough. And this is why this year, as part of our replenishment of the ADF, the Africa Development Fund, which is our constitutional window, we actually set out also to establish what we call a climate action window to raise $4 to $13 billion of climate finance. But in order for conscious that our focus is on adaptation, we are actually going to allocate at least 60% of those resources for purposes of adaptation. So in other words, if we get $10 billion, 60% will be adaptation. And here I want to say a big, big thank you to the UK, because although it is not fully established, UK has understood and is in perfect resonance with the needs of Africa, and UK has actually committed on Monday, UK announced £200 million for purposes of this climate action window. On the same day, we also received confirmation from the Netherlands that they will also contribute about €100 million for the same purpose. So I think the leadership of UK in this regard is highly appreciated. But I know for a fact, one of the big things that was discussed today was the issue of food security. And this is very important on the continent. And why it is important on the continent is, fancy this, every day, 250 million Africans go to bed hungry. And this is, and we understand, and this is not going to be any easier because of the climate change. And of those, about 60 million are children who also go home hungry, and they are malnourished and stunted because of lack of that, or lack of food. So as a result, with the idea of the idea to focus today's event on agriculture and cooling is really, really timely and very welcome, because although there are many agricultural technologies that can increase food supply and improve resilience, we are also aware that the technologies are very, very localized. It's not like in mitigation, where these are huge projects. These are small context or sort of focused projects that are involved in adaptation, and therefore not similar to your typical mitigation projects, which are huge projects with good revenues and profitability. So what we are trying to do here is to come up with a number of innovative mechanisms that can be used to improve the acceptability or the rollout of adaptation as in the private sector. And some of the mechanisms, if you allow me to mention them, is the adaptation benefits mechanism, which for me is pace setting, and I take a lot of pride from my colleagues in the climate finance team, because this particular mechanism is the first, I do believe, is the first mechanism or effort to quantify the benefits of adaptation. And I do believe that it has found it's been found to be sufficiently logical, to the extent that it's been accepted as part of the non-market mechanisms, which are part of the Article 6.8, Gareth, of the Paris Agreement. Then, of course, we have the ADRIFI. This is what we call the Africa Disaster Risk Financing and Facility, which is used to provide insurance against some of these adverse climate events. Then, of course, we have the Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program, which I mentioned earlier. We hope to raise about $25 billion from that. So in a nutshell, all I would say is that those are some of the new initiatives that we are doing. But all I can say is that the need for adaptation finance in Africa is huge. And it is not by chance. It is because what we know is that Africa's climate change is locked in for the next 20 years. And as a result, it behoves us to address adaptation and resilient building. So in a nutshell, agriculture and cooling are two critical areas of climate adaptation. And if we fail to address this effectively, we will lock in greater greenhouse gas emissions, making it the problem even worse for everybody else. In my view, there's no option but to address these challenges head-on, and I look forward to working with our partners, FCDO and EIB, as we improve the quality and life of millions of people in Africa, and especially the ones that today go home sleep hungry every single day. 250,000 people every single day, of whom 60 million are children under 5 years old. I mean, I don't think we have a choice but to try and stand out for them and try and improve the qualities of their life. Let me stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vice President Kariuki. Thank you. Much appreciated. And now it's time to close this event. I just want to, Frederick, I haven't given you another word just to say yes, no. You heard what Vice President Kariuki had to say. Do you think it will be enough? Yes or no?
No.
I don't know if that was the right answer, but there we go. Always honest. Thank you so very much for those inspiring remarks. So next I would like to ask Stephen O'Driscoll, the Manager for Environment, Climate and Social at the European Investment Bank, the world's biggest MDB, to come and give us some closing remarks, bearing in mind that the idea of this event is to think about new, innovative ways that the MDBs can work together, what we can start working on with a view to launching at COP28. Be very interesting to hear what you've pulled out of this event and what you think are the next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Vice President. Some very profound words there, and thank you, Frederick, for being so honest in the answer. Really pleased to be able to host this event today. I'll be brief because I think we're all exhausted from trying to listen to the speakers over the noise, and I think we deserve a drink. Thank you to Sonia, so expertly moderated as usual. What she failed to tell us in her opening, of course, was that she's behind the E3G climate tracker, which keeps us MDBs well and truly on our toes, so appreciate that. Thank you to FCDO as well, and to E3G for kind of initiating this series of workshops. I mean, we do talk together very seriously as a group about adaptation and adaptation solutions and so on, but this has actually helped to kind of focus the mind in certain areas, so it's been very useful. I mean, one of the things that I've learned from the first 3 or 4 days here is that we're actually talking at a level of detail that we just weren't talking a year or so ago in Glasgow. And you know, the language, I think we're all talking a common language now with regard to adaptation, which I think is useful. And we have done a lot of thinking, and we are thinking differently. Some of the initiatives and the instruments that are now being kind of proffered do actually show that we're really thinking hard. I particularly like the adaptation benefit mechanism that Gareth talked about, and I think at EIB we will certainly look at that in a lot more detail. And you know, this thinking, we have the climate resilient debt clauses, we have various other things, the debt for nature swaps, and on the initiative side we have the adaptation accelerator pipeline, which is turning the things into, you know, investment projects. So, you know, all of this will help us scale up and move forward. Just a few takeaways from my perspective. I didn't actually realize that cooling demand was likely to triple in the night. We don't need a lot of cooling in Luxembourg, but we need heating, so going the other way. So it's that's quite interesting. Diane, you talked about Antigua and Barbuda perhaps being too small and not being on the radar of the MDBs. That's pretty shocking, particularly since you guys are the ones that are suffering the most. So, you know, we need to address that, and certainly the EIB, our adaptation plan allows us to actually take a little bit more risk. So certainly for small island developing states, we're looking at financing 100% of project costs rather than 50%, which is what we historically do. Dawda, your thoughts on Islamic financing, very interesting potential there. And philanthropy, I mean, the watchwords there were complementarity and investment readiness, and that kind of speaks to the 3 C's that came out of New York, so commitment, collaboration and complementarity. So certainly we should always have that in mind when we're working on this. And then Frederick, you spoke very eloquently about some of the issues that you're facing there, and You touched on the reform of the MDBs. I mean, we've obviously got the Stern-Songway paper now there and the Bridgetown agenda, so we're kind of waiting with bated breath as to what that might mean for the MDBs. Whether that will result in a capital increase or not, you know, I'm not too sure, but that may kind of ease things up a little bit, but we'll see. Just in terms of going forward, Sonia, we have an action to come back to you on the paper, so we'll try and do that. And I would suggest that we keep talking. I think it's been a good collaboration, and we should probably come back at COP28 and do a kind of stock take on what we've got to, where we got to. And just a quick shout out for Doda's event on Saturday with the EIB, where we'll be presenting the adaptation tracking methodology, which we've been updated. And also for an EIB event on just resilience, on our approach to just transition outside the EU, where just resilience is a concept that we're interested in. So this is, you know, looking at the impacts of adaptation-related policies at government level, not just on the mitigation side. So a quick shout out for that. So thank you all very much for coming, and have a pleasant evening.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all our speakers, all our panelists. Thank you to all of you who came and who stayed for so long. I know it's late in the day, I know it's tiring, I know there's no water, there's no food, it's too cold, so thank you. But just to say thank you to FCDO, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, who made this project happen, made this event happen. Thank you to Ade and Simon in particular. Thank you to the European Investment Bank, who gave us this slot here in the MDB Pavilion, also making this possible. We will be taking everything that was discussed today, putting it into 2 papers, sending that around to all of you over the next few weeks. We want to build on these ideas, keep talking, keep coming up with new ideas, and as we say, as Steve just said, let's come together again at COP28 Dubai to have a stock take, to see what progress we've made, to report back, and to see whether there's even more we can do together. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining. This is the beginning, and see you in Dubai. Thank you.